world, but it really is a moment of liberation for people. So the strictures that had, bound them in their Soviet lives were loosened and, completely shaken loose. And so these people were able to try to be something else, or try to be more of themselves, or some idea of what they wanted to be. And also this first encounter with capitalism, which was so foreign to them. There were people who, part of what they did is they would sell stuff, like as the introduction is, they brought things that they'd heard you could sell at the markets. There were some people who were very adept at it, and some people who were deeply intimidated by it. They'd never traded. It was so intimidating, this whole capitalist idea. And so you had people who filled that gap. There were brokers. It was, all of these sort of latent capabilities came to the fore.
Samuel, the patriarch, is a marvelous figure. He's resisted. He's had to travel with his family, but he's resisted somewhat, and he's tremendously proud of the part he's played, and his musings are quite wonderful, some of them about the revisionism that will necessarily follow as people tell certain stories about their life in Russia, complain about it, but not about this other history of which he's very proud. Did you have to discover that, or were you hearing it as a child? Was that a domain of particular research?
In choosing these three voices and also the constitution of the family, I'd hope to be representative of the full scope of what Soviet Jews are across generations. And I knew quite early on that there had to be a character like Samuel, which is a Russian Jew who was born right around the time of the revolution, a little bit before, and fought in the Second World War, and believed staunchly in communism, and let's say even compromised himself morally, as maybe we would say he compromised himself morally, in the service of communism. That wasn't unusual. But I think particularly in the West, here, the story of Eastern European Jewry and the story of European Jewry is always kind of like Poland and parts West. Somehow what happened Poland and parts East is less known, which we can kind of understand because it was, again, the rival superpowers. We didn't know that much about them. There was propaganda both ways. But these men who were staunch communists, who considered themselves victors, not victims of the Second World War, who fought with the Red Army. That was my childhood. Those were all the men of that generation, for the most part, were those men. Less so the communist part, though there was certainly that as well. But for me, I felt so deeply for this generation. And it's such a tragic generation that it was very important for me to have somebody like that here. Samuel is, I guess the extreme example of one of these people, an extreme example, but also not exceptional. Extreme without being exceptional.
I did visit the neighboring Ukraine last year, where they've just, in Kiev, erected another statue of Stalin. And there's a fierce nostalgia there, as you'll find in St. Petersburg, where many want to rename it the city Leningrad. Was there a consciousness, would there have been a consciousness in a figure like Samuel, of the progression Stalin made to such a brutal and heavy-handed anti-Semitism?
Samuel would have been one of those people who said Stalin didn't know. And he didn't know.
Yeah.
Stalin didn't know. It wasn't him. That there were people who were doing things, in his name, that if only Stalin knew, it would have been stopped. And there was, countless people who believed that and would write letters to Stalin hoping they would get through.
And the more comic figure of Joseph Rodman, who becomes his friend, who's writing the one-legged violinist composing this opera, came from where?
So, for every Samuel, who's a very rigid, staunch communist, a very austere person, august person, I knew a Rodman, who was kind of a comic, kind of Heimishy, Jewishy old man, who made jokes and who, strangely enough, would have also fought in the war. And these sorts of guys who had no place, you would think, fighting in any war. And they, and they all did. They all served. But later in life, they just become these, sort of these, comic, funny, warm, witty, self-deprecating Jewish old men. And he becomes Samuel's closest friend in a way, because he's easy to get along with. He doesn't judge Samuel. He kind of flows with everything. And I felt that just the way the book is structured, Samuel has so much resentment against everybody in his family because of what's happened. There's nobody that he can talk to. And Rodman provides that. And I needed that there to be somebody in the present tense. So it wasn't constantly just in recollection, that Samuel had a friend, somebody who was a confidant in some way.
The family takes him repeatedly to the Canadian embassy for interviews. An interesting scene in this is not to diminish in any way, but if you read Hinton Mystery's Family Matters, there's a similar thing, but with a more corrupt fella. Your Canadian embassy person isn't necessarily corrupt, but he's not aided at all by Samuel's recalcitrance. I mean,
yeah. I mean, the story is at the time, here's how it broke down between the US and Canada. To get into the United States, if you were a communist, you were in trouble. So what everybody tried to do is they had to write, stories of persecution, also my party story. So if anybody had been a party member, you would write, I was a party member not because I believed in communism, but because I was forced to in order to gain my position. That was the only way I could do it, or some such thing. In Canada, because we were on the point system, they wanted young professional families. And if you were traveling with old people who were infirm, that was a problem. So the Americans didn't want communists, and the Canadians didn't want sick people. To put a strain on our wonderful healthcare system. And so that's the problem with Samuel. He lived through.
And the true crook in the bunch is, at one point, I can't remember who says it, but it's clear that he'll end up in Germany. It's sort of written almost offhandedly. They were even less restricting, or what?
It was easier to get into Germany. I mean, the easiest place was to go to Israel, but a lot of people didn't want to go to Israel, particularly these people. And the Jewish agencies that took care of these refugees in Rome, Hayas and Joint, the JDC, they kind of felt bad about pawning off all these criminals on Israel, right? So they tried to distribute them a little bit, a crook here as you could.
And Lyova, is that how?
Lyova. Yeah.
Lyova describes the idea of returning to Israel or home to the Soviet Union. He's in a sort of double limbo because he's trying to get into the United States. His family's in Israel. He describes a return to either place as pathological. I mean, politics or Zionist purpose isn't high in the minds of many.
No, or they would have been in Israel already. They had their choice, right? Like in Vienna, if they were Zionists, they would have just gone. So anybody who ends up in Rome is somebody who, I wouldn't even say that they're not sympathetic to Israel. They're just pragmatic for a lot of them, for a couple of reasons. One is, these people left not because they were Zionists, but because they wanted better lives. And they were just kind of shopping around. Where can we go that'll be better for us? The States, Canada, where's the opportunity? Not to diminish also, for a lot of people, the opportunity to be Jewish again. But they didn't feel they needed to go to Israel necessarily to do that. And the other part is, going back to the war, I think it's also true. 20 million Soviet citizens died in the Second World War, something like that. Jews disproportionately so. I think it played a role for Soviet Jews when they were thinking about Israel because of, wars and the thought of losing another generation or somebody. For a lot of people, they just wanted peace. And so that was, by the time they got to Italy, those were the considerations that were in play more than anything else. For somebody like Lyoba, he's interesting because, and again, I knew people like him, and one man in particular, who had served with the Red Army, ended up in Czechoslovakia, was greatly disillusioned, and then ended up in Israel, and ended up having to spend time after the Yom Kippur War in '73, doing some duty in Gaza, and that was it for him.
He wants to go to a country with the fewest parades, I think.
That's how he phrases it at this point.
I wonder, I mean, it seems clear first of all, why did you concentrate, or what led you to concentrate on this period in between Latvia, Russia, and eventually Canada, the United States for some, time in Rome?
I was aware, knowing the whole kind of arc of the immigration that Soviet Jews went through, that my family went through. The part, just superficially speaking, that always intrigued me the most was this very peculiar intermediate period which was in Rome. So it was a transmigration point. So what happened was Soviet Jews left the Soviet Union ostensibly to go to Israel. You couldn't leave unless you had a visa to go to Israel. And for certainly at the beginning of this wave of immigration, a lot of people did. And after a time, the real diehard Zionists had already emigrated, and you had people who were seeking the opportunity to leave, not because they were Zionists, but because they wanted to get out of the Soviet Union, because for any number of reasons. And these people started to, once they got to Vienna, say, okay, we want to declare refugee status. We don't want to go to Israel. Why should we? We'd like to go elsewhere. And then all of a sudden you had this strange phenomenon where you had thousands, at a certain point, tens of thousands of Soviet Jews in Rome and the surrounding areas. Ladispoli was one town, Ostia was another. And that was just so peculiar to me to think about. And I would listen to my parents and their friends talk about it. Remember that this is, the time of the Eastern Bloc, the Iron Curtain. These are people who never thought they'd get out of the Soviet Union. Many of them were people who had never been out of the Soviet Union. And to end up in all places in Rome, sort of in the cradle of Western civilization. Fascinating and romantic and all of these things. And I was seduced by that idea. And also this idea that it was this point, it was sort of like a pivot point between the future that was kind of still unclear for a lot of them, and the past, which was so very recent and still kind of held its claims on them. And, I wanted to tell the story of really this whole, the best way to explain it is I wanted to tell the story of the Soviet Jewish experience. And that I thought was the best place to do it, where to have people reflect back wouldn't feel like an affect. It would seem, viable, authentic, because they had just left this place and they were still coming to terms with it.
And they're not yet anything else. And in the same way you speak of women's qualities becoming exaggerated in front of the pre-epic Alec, I suppose that's true of all the players in this, pressure cooker of a moment, in which some get jobs, but others have to rely on shenanigans. And of course, Russia has, at the same time, as you point out, offloaded a lot of criminals who happen to be Jewish and dumped them into this forum. So was that a place in which people's qualities became sufficiently exaggerated for you to be able to have fun as an author with them?
Precisely that.